just leave it like that. There we go. Yeah, I figured, yeah, I had to unmute it. That's a good idea. We're not singing this morning. Sorry. A little bit from Luke 16, and then I'm going to introduce Mike Matique, who's going to sort of introduce the topic today. We're watching a video is done as part of a Redeemer Presbyterian Church evening where they where they discussed our matters at hand. So this you heard Tim Keller introduce the topic using the biblical sources last week, and today we're going to hear Brian Stevenson, who is a professor, was a graduate of Eastern University, a professor of law at NYU, Harvard law grad, and his work that he's been doing trying to do justice in his life. Luke 16, the 15th, starting with the 19th verse. There was a rich man who was clothed in purple and fine linen, and who feasted sumptuously every day. And at his gate lay a poor man named Lazarus, full of sores, who desired to be fed from what fell from the rich man's table. Moreover, the dogs came and licked his sores. The poor man died and was carried by the angels to Abraham's bosom. The rich man also died and was buried. And in Hades, being in torment, he lifted up his eyes and saw Abraham far off and Lazarus in his bosom. And he called out, Father Abraham, have mercy on me, and send Lazarus to dip the end of his finger in water and cool my tongue, for I am in anguish in this flame. But Abraham said, Son, remember that you in your lifetime received your good things, and Lazarus in like manner evil things. But now he is comforted here, and you are in anguish. And besides all this, between us there is a great chasm has been fixed, in order that those who would pass from here to you may not be able, and none may cross from there to us. And he said, Then I beg you, Father, to send him to my father's house, for I have 5 brothers, so that he may warn them, lest they also come into this place of torment. But Abraham said, They have Moses and the prophets. Let them hear them. And he said, No, Father Abraham, but if someone goes to them from the dead, they will repent. And he said to him, If they do not hear Moses and the prophets, neither will they be convinced if someone should rise from the dead. I've heard that I've heard folks who know about this passage say that the rich man's sin was that he just didn't see Lazarus. He was inside his gate and he didn't see him. And we're going to be talking about, and Brian Stevenson is going to be talking about proximity today. I, for one, am disturbed by this passage, and I hate to think about it and consider it or even read it, because it has a bit of an accusatory tone toward those of us who have some means. It's always going to be uncomfortable, and I guess this video this morning is going to make us uncomfortable as well. But before we begin, I want Mike to kind of come and give us a warm-up here. And Mike Matika, professor at Eastern University, member here since 2003, and a little bit crazy, but a great guy.
It's true, I'm very crazy. And in fact, it's very interesting because I preached on that message, that passage in Malawi. And my message was, some of us here, we have relatives who are in hell and they are crying out. So you better listen to the message or else you are going to end up in the same place. So it's just wonderful. I think what we're going to see Brian Stevenson talking about can be a pretty strong message. And I have read his book. I've listened to him several times. I have met him not one-to-one, but when he was presenting in his many ways. But I want to bring a number of points as we listen to this. First, every person, whatever the racial group, is a product of life experiences. It's a product of life experiences. And I believe that those life experiences mold us who we are, what we are, the kinds of things that we do. These experiences, these life experiences, are instituted and legitimated or justified through families, the workplace, the church, politics, network of relatives and friends, schools and colleges, entertainment, systems of law and order, and all sorts of systems of healthcare and everything. These life experiences are instituted in that. That's the second point. The third point, when we interact with one another, our life experiences meet, and sometimes they crash. But they meet. We badly need to understand others' life experiences. What are their experiences? What have they been dealing with? What are they dealing with? Whatever the racial group, it doesn't really matter. If we are to really practice justice, we have to understand the experiences where people are coming from. And this is the thing. If we were to avoid being oppressive, if I were to avoid being unjust, then it is important for us to understand the pain the others are experiencing. Now, racism, just like justice, is a product of life experiences. In our experiences, we might find that we may be on this side of the scale or that side of the scale. But my point here is, if we are to live the life that Christ has called us to live in community, one of the most interesting thing, and for every human being, is just learning from each other about those life experiences. Asking questions about life experiences. I belong to a wonderful Bible study group, but I also know I don't know all their life experiences. But you can just imagine if we were to exchange those life experiences and learn from one another, that would be wonderful. Now, some of the points that Brian Stevenson brings up is just like, how practical is that going to be? I think it is practical based on how we look at a number of things. But I think the takeaway for me is I want to know your life experiences, and I believe you want to know my life experiences. And through that process, we will be able to help one another to live a life that is abundant in Christ. And so I just wanted to make those remarks as we start watching this. video. And I do believe that if we see the main points, it makes 4 main points. Today, I think 2. Next week, another 2. Maybe we can organize ourselves asking questions. Is it possible for us to deal with that? But is it possible for us to learn from one another in our life experiences? Thank you so much.
Here, working on behalf of the poor, the incarcerated, and the... Brian Stevenson is the founder and executive director of the Equal Justice Initiative in Montgomery, Alabama. Mr. Stevenson is a widely acclaimed public interest lawyer who's spent his year working on behalf of the poor, the incarcerated, and the condemned. Under his leadership, EJI has won major legal challenges eliminating excessive and unfair sentencing, exonerating innocent death row prisoners, confronting abuse of the incarcerated and the mentally ill, and aiding children prosecuted as adults. Mr. Stevenson has argued several cases in the United States Supreme Court and recently won a historic ruling that mandatory life without parole sentences for all children 17 or younger are unconstitutional. Mr. Stevenson and his staff have won reversals, relief, or release for over 115 wrongly condemned prisoners on death row. Mr. Stevenson has initiated major new anti-poverty and anti-discrimination efforts that challenge the legacy of racial inequality in America, including major projects to educate communities about slavery, lynching, and racial segregation. Finally, Mr. Stevenson also knows a lot about New York. He has been a professor at law at New York University School of Law for the past 18 years. Please join me in welcoming Brian Stevenson.
Really powerful, thank you. Oh, thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. It is such an honor to be here. I'm so thrilled to be with you here tonight. I'm really excited to be in this space. I'm really energized by Dr. Keller's sermon and the way he has set a context for the conversation I want to have tonight. I want to talk about what does it require for us to do justice, love mercy, and walk humbly with God. That's a scripture. Prophet Micah talks about, what do we have to do to be pleasing to God? And should we offer all of these great things? We have to do these big and extraordinary things. And what the prophet says is, no, you just have to do justice, you have to love mercy, and you have to walk humbly with God. And in many ways, this need to do justice, this need to change the world is something that I feel really keenly. And so I want to talk tonight about what I think we need to do to change the world. And by changing the world, do justice and love mercy. There's a real need for it. We're a very different country today than we were 50 years ago. In 1972, there were 300,000 people in jails and prisons in America. Today, there are 2.3 million people in jails and prisons. The United States now has the highest rate of incarceration in the world. We have 6 million people on probation or parole. There are 70 million Americans with criminal arrests, which means that when they try to get a job or try to get a loan, they're disfavored. We've done some terrible things to women in our society. The percentage of women going to prison has increased 640% over the last 20 years, and 70% of these women are single parents with minor children, which means that when they go to jails or prisons, their children are displaced. There are these collateral consequences. Last year, the president came to Selma, Alabama, to my state of Alabama, and he came to Selma to commemorate the 50th anniversary of the Voting Rights Act and that historic march from Selma to Montgomery. And members of Congress came and thousands of people came and they crossed the Edmund Pettus Bridge to celebrate that historic march. And very few of them realized that today in Alabama, 30% of the black male population has permanently lost the right to vote as a result of a criminal conviction. Half the people we have in jails and prisons suffer from mental illness. 20% are acutely mentally ill. The statistic that keeps me up late at night is one from the Bureau of Justice. The Bureau of Justice now predicts that 1 in 3 black male babies born in this country is expected to go to jail or prison during his lifetime. 1 in 3. It wasn't true in the 19th century. It wasn't true in the 20th century. It's become true in the 21st century. The statistic for Latino boys is 1 in 6. So I think there's this urgent need for us to change the world. There is this urgent need to do justice. And I could talk about the problems all night, but I didn't come to talk about the problems. I want to talk about the solutions. I want to talk about what I think we can do to create more justice. The first thing I am persuaded we have to do is I am persuaded that if you want to do justice, if you want to love mercy, you've got to get proximate to the places and the people where injustice is made known. You cannot stay in safe places. You cannot stay in comfortable places. I believe we are called to get proximate to the places in our community where there's poverty and suffering and abuse and neglect. Many of us have been taught our whole lives that if there are parts of our town, our community, where the schools aren't very good, where there's violence, where there's drug addiction, where there's despair, where there's neglect or abuse, you should stay as far away from those places as possible. I'm here tonight to tell you the opposite. I actually think to do justice, you've got to get closer to the schools where kids are struggling. You've got to get closer to the parts of our community where there's poverty and abuse and violence and neglect and despair. And in proximity, I am persuaded we can find power. I think there's power in proximity. You don't have to have all the answers and the solutions, but you've got to be willing to get closer to the places where there's inequality. We've got policymakers and politicians trying to solve problems from a distance. And when you try to solve problems from a distance, your solutions don't work because you miss the details of the problems, the nuances of the problems. I believe you've got to get proximate. I'm the product of someone's choice to get proximate. I grew up in the rural South in a community where black children couldn't go to the public schools. I started my education in a colored school. When I was a little boy, we couldn't go to the public school. In my county, there were no high schools for black children when my dad was a teenager. And then one day the lawyers came into our community and they insisted that that county respond to Brown versus Board of Education. They made them open up the public schools, and because of that, I got to go to high school. And I am not confused about how I got here. I got here because people were willing to get proximate to poor black kids like me. And I got to go to high school. I graduated from high school and I got to go to college. Went to Eastern University in Pennsylvania. Great school, yes, thank you. Beautiful campus. When I got to college, I'd never seen a world like that. I was very active in music. I was very active in sports. I was a philosophy major. And about my second year in college, I woke up one morning and I realized something. I realized I really like college. And I made a decision. I decided that I was going to spend the rest of my life in college. And I called my mom up and said, Mom, I've made a decision. I've decided to spend the rest of my life in college. My mom said, I didn't go to college, but I don't think they're going to let you do that. I said, Mom, they will. And I was a senior, still majoring in philosophy. And because I was a philosophy major, I thought I was supposed to go out on the hillside and think these deep thoughts. And I was out there one day thinking my so-called deep thoughts. And somebody came up to me and said, you are a senior and you are a philosophy major. What are you going to do when you graduate from college? And I heard this as a very hostile question because I realized nobody was going to pay me to philosophize. And so I frantically started trying to figure out, how do I stay in school? And because nobody in my family had gone to school, I didn't know what everybody in this room, I'm sure, already knows. I didn't know that in this country, if you want to do graduate work in history or English or political science, to get admitted to graduate school, you actually have to know something about history, English, or political science. That was pretty intimidating to me, so I kept looking, and to be honest, that's how I found law school. It was very clear to me, you don't need to know anything to go to law school. So I signed up for that, and a few months later, I found myself sitting in a classroom at Harvard Law School, and I was deeply disillusioned because they weren't talking about the things that motivated. I went to law school because I was concerned about racial inequality, I was concerned about poverty, I was concerned about social injustice, and it didn't seem like anybody was talking about race or poverty or injustice. I left the law school after my first year to go to the School of Government at Harvard. I decided to pursue a degree in public policy. And I woke up after I'd been there a couple of months one day, and I was looking in the mirror, and I thought to myself, wow, I'm even more miserable here than I was at the law school. They were teaching us to maximize benefits and minimize costs, but it didn't seem to matter whose benefits got maximized and whose costs got minimized. I went back to the law school, and then I was about to do this thing I pray none of you ever do. I was about to do this thing where I was trying to persuade myself to accept a career as a lawyer that I knew was not going to be affirming, that I knew was not going to be energizing, that I knew was not what I was called to. And then I got proximate. I took a course that required me to spend time with a human rights organization in Georgia, and I went down and I met these lawyers providing legal services to people on death row. And there was a community of people there, and I was energized by what I saw. And I'd been there a week, and one of the lawyers said, "We need you to go to death row and meet someone we haven't had time to meet. We just need you to go down and explain to him that he's not at risk of execution anytime in the next year." I drove down there the next day, and I was very nervous because I was persuaded that this man wouldn't want to just see a law student. I tried to rehearse exactly what I was going to say, and I went into the prison. They took me to the cell, and I was pacing back and forth, really nervous, really anxious, and finally they opened the door, and there stood the first condemned prisoner I'd ever seen. And what struck me about him was how burdened with chains he was. He had handcuffs on his wrists, he had a chain around his waist, he had shackles on his ankles, and I stood there while they unchained him, and I got so nervous that by the time he walked inside, I'd forgotten what I was supposed to say, and I just said, "I'm so sorry, I'm just a law student. I don't know anything about the death penalty. I don't know anything about civil procedure. I don't know anything about criminal procedure. I don't know anything about appellate procedure. Oh, but they sent me down here to tell you that you're not at risk of execution anytime in the next year." And as soon as I said that, the man said, wait, say that again. I said, "You're not at risk of execution anytime in the next year." And the man said, wait, say that again. I said, "You're not at risk of execution anytime in the next year." And that's when this man grabbed my hands. He said, "Thank you, thank you, thank you." He said, "You're the first person I've met who's not a death row prisoner or a death row guard in the 2 years I've been on death row." He said, "I've been talking to my wife and my kids at night, but I haven't let them come and visit because I was afraid I'd have an execution date, and I didn't want them to have to deal with that." He said, "Now because of you, I'm going to see my wife, I'm going to see my kids. Thank you, thank you, thank you." And I couldn't believe how even in my ignorance, how just being proximate could be transformative in the life of someone else. But all of a sudden it kicked in and we started talking, this man and me, and it turned out we were exactly the same age. We had the same birthday, same month, same day, same year. He started asking me questions about my life. I asked him questions about his life, and we fell into this conversation. And 1 hour turned into 2 hours, and 2 hours turned into 3 hours. I'd only scheduled to be there an hour, and the guards were getting angry waiting outside the room. And finally, after 3 hours, they couldn't take it any longer, so they came bursting into the room, and they were frustrated. And they couldn't do anything to me, so they took it out on this man. They threw him against the wall. And they began putting the chains on him very roughly. I tried to get them to be gentler, but they ignored me. And they put the handcuffs on his wrists so tightly I could see him grimacing with pain. They wrapped the chain around his waist so tightly. I said, "Please, it's not his fault, it's my fault. Don't take it out on him," but they ignored me. And then they put the shackles on his ankles so tight you could see him struggling. And I was really stressed by this. And this condemned man looked at me and he said, "Brian, don't worry about this. You just come back." And then they started shoving this man toward the door. He almost fell down. He kept his balance and he kept pushing him so roughly, and they got him in front of the door. And then I watched this man do something. He planted his feet, and the next time when they shoved him, he didn't move. And then this man turned to me and he looked at me and he said, "Brian, don't worry about this. You just come back." And then that man did something I've never forgotten. I stood there and I watched him close his eyes, throw his head back, and then he started to sing. And he started singing this hymn. He started singing, "I'm pressing on the upward way. New heights I'm gaining every day, still praying as I'm onward bound." And then he said, "Lord, plant my feet on higher ground." Everybody stopped. The guards recovered. They started pushing him down the hallway. You could hear the chains clanging, but you could hear this man singing about higher ground. And I will tell you, hearing that man's song changed me. All of a sudden, I knew I wanted to help condemned people get to higher ground. But more than that, I knew that my journey to higher ground was tied to his journey. I realized that if he doesn't get there, I can't get there. And in an instant, my interest in law was radicalized. I went back to Harvard Law School. You couldn't get me out of the law school library. I needed to know everything about substantive due process and procedural due process and civil procedure and appellate procedure. I needed to know it all because now I wanted to help condemned people get to higher ground. I tell you that because there's power in proximity. You don't have to have all the solutions when you go into poor neighborhoods. You don't have to have solutions when you go into jails and prisons. You don't have to know everything there is to know when you're working with the formerly incarcerated. You don't have to know how to deal with all the nuances of drug addiction and despair and violence, but I urge you to recognize that if you choose to get proximate, you will find a power that allows you to do justice. There is power in proximity. Second thing, I don't think we can do what we're trying to do. We can't change the world. We can't do justice by just getting proximate. The second thing I'm persuaded we have to do is that we've got to change narratives. You see, the problems that we're talking about in this country and across the world are the results of policy decisions and political things, but underneath those problems, there are narratives. And we've got to change some of those narratives. We have mass incarceration in this country. We have excessive punishment because we chose to deal with drug addiction and drug dependency as a crime issue instead of a health issue. We could have said that drug addiction and drug dependency, that's a health problem. And let's use our health infrastructure to address that problem. We did that for alcoholism. We don't regard alcoholism as a crime. We regard that as a disease. We used a health model. And if we know someone who's alcoholic and we see them going into a bar, we don't think, oh, let's call the police. We think, let's try to intervene. But for drug addiction and drug dependency, we said they're criminals. And we've put hundreds of thousands of people in jails and prisons. It is the primary reason we have these huge race disparities. But there was a narrative that caused us to see that as a crime rather than a health crisis. And that narrative was rooted in what I call the politics of fear and anger. Our politicians have been preaching to us, be afraid and be angry for decades. And I will tell you that when you make decisions rooted in fear and anger, you will tolerate oppression. You will tolerate inequality. You will tolerate injustice. And I believe we are called to reject fear and anger. And we've got to change that narrative. I've seen it happen to children. My clients have gotten younger and younger and younger. There were some people going around the country 30 years ago arguing that some children aren't children. They began to argue that there are some kids in our society that may look like kids and may talk like kids, but they said these aren't really kids. They said these are super predators. And they used this word to demonize a generation of children, mostly black and brown kids. And every state in the country lowered the minimum age for trying children as adults. You did it here in the state of New York. There's a campaign going on right now to raise the age in response to this hysteria created by this super predator myth. And today we have thousands of kids serving decades of adult incarceration. I've represented 9 and 10-year-old children facing decades of imprisonment. We have 13 and 14-year-old children in this country who've been condemned to die in prison with life imprisonment without parole sentences. And there's a narrative that created this hysteria. And we've got to change the narrative. A few years ago, I was working on a case involving a 14-year-old boy who lived in a household where his mother was repeatedly the target of a lot of domestic violence. This boy's mother had a boyfriend. And when this man would come home, he would sometimes get violent if he'd been drinking. And one day he'd been drinking, and he came into the house. He didn't say anything. He just called the boy's mother into the kitchen. And he walked up to her, and he punched her in the face. She fell. She hit her head as she fell, and she was on the floor bleeding and unconscious. Her son came running into the kitchen to try to help his mom. He tried to stop the bleeding. He tried to get her to wake up. But no matter what he did, she wouldn't respond. And after 10 minutes, this child thought his mom was dead. She wasn't dead, but he thought his mom was dead. The little boy got up and he walked into the bedroom where the man had fallen asleep. And he walked over to the dresser drawer where he knew this man kept his handgun. And this little boy grabbed that gun and he walked over to where the man was sleeping and he pointed the gun at the man's head. The man was snoring. And when the man stopped snoring, this little boy panicked and tragically pulled the trigger and shot this man in the head. The man was killed almost instantly. This little boy was very small for his age. He was under 5 feet tall. He weighed less than 100 pounds. He'd never been in trouble before. He was the kind of kid that might have been tried as a juvenile, but for the fact that the man that he shot and killed, his mother's boyfriend, well, that man was a deputy sheriff. And because he was a deputy sheriff, the prosecutor insisted that this child be tried as an adult. And the judge certified him to stand trial as an adult, and they immediately placed him in the adult jail. He'd been there 3 days before his grandmother got me involved in the case. I went to the jail to meet this little boy. He walked in, this little tiny kid, terrified. And he sat down, and I started asking him questions, but no matter what I asked him, he wouldn't say anything. He just sat there. And I finally put my pen down. I said, look, I can't help you if you don't talk to me. You got to talk to me. The little boy wouldn't say anything. He just kept staring at the wall. I got up and I walked around the table. I pulled my chair close to him. I said, come on, you got to talk to me. I can't help you if you don't talk to me. And the little boy wouldn't say anything. He just kept staring. Couldn't figure out what to do. I sat there and I just couldn't figure out what to do. And at some point, I just leaned on him. I don't even know why, but I leaned on him. And when I leaned on him, he leaned back. And when he leaned back, I put my arm around him and I said, come on, you got to talk to me. I can't help you if you don't talk to me. And that's when this little boy started to cry. And through his tears, he began talking to me, not about what happened with the man, not about what happened with his mom, but he started talking to me about what had happened at the jail. He told me on the first night several men had hurt him. He told me on the next night he'd been raped by several people. He told me on the night before I'd gotten there, so many people had hurt him, he couldn't remember how many there had been. And then this little boy cried hysterically for almost an hour. I finally got him calm, and I said, look, I'm going to get you out of here. You stay right here. I'm going to get you out of here. And I never will forget trying to leave that jail and that little boy grabbing my arm saying, please, please, please don't go. I said, no, it's okay. It's all right. I'm going to get you out of here. You stay right here. And I left that jail, and the question I had in my mind when I left that jail is, who is responsible for this? And the answer is, we are. We are. We've allowed a narrative to emerge in this country that some children aren't children. We've allowed this distance to be created from the most vulnerable children in our society, and we have thrown away the abused children. We have thrown away the vulnerable children. We've thrown away the kids that are struggling with trauma and neglect. We have thrown away the kids that join these gangs, and I'm here to tell you that if we want to do justice, we've got to change the narrative. I believe God calls us to recognize that all children are children. We are all God's children, and we cannot throw away any member of this community. We've got to understand that doing justice means claiming the children that other people throw away. It means claiming those who are rejected by others. We've got to change.
Next time. I guess one question we could discuss here is, when was there a time when you were proximate to folks who were not like you? I think there were a couple times in my life. One was when I ended up going to this camp in the city of Milwaukee in 1967, just before the craziness of all the city riots happened. And Detroit and Chicago and Milwaukee all kind of really had a difficult time. And we got to meet a lot of these black children in the inner city of Milwaukee. And they were great kids. I remember enjoying my time there very much. It didn't seem like they were much different from me. And then the other time, I'm not sure, I certainly didn't change anybody's life that week, but I did get a look at what they were facing. The other time, and I think this is common to many people, is when you go off to college, you're kind of all thrown in. No one knows anybody, and all kinds of different people are there. And I got to meet my friend Art Coleman, who was a junior there at Grinnell. And he was a black man from from Kansas City, I'm sorry. And I got a chance to actually travel down and see his house in Kansas City. And it was sort of a middle-class house. It was in a better part of a black community, but it was still uncomfortable for me, being the minority instead of the majority. Art was a guy who really preached the gospel to me throughout my freshman year, and I got involved with the university fellowship because of him, and got to be in his fellowship group, and really helped me get through college. Again, it was a situation where I wasn't really helping anybody, but I was certainly helped by the fact that I got to meet this guy. Does anyone have any, yes, okay.
Two experiences come to mind. One, I spent some time at the Moria refugee camp in Greece and spent a lot of time with Afghanis and with Syrians, and so changed my idea of what a refugee was and what a Muslim was. And then another experience, I spent in Beirut for a couple of weeks and spent a lot of time particularly with two Kurdish women. And those experiences just transformed my life.
Hey, Tom, you just said something, and I don't know how I've never put this together, but, and I don't even know if this is on topic because I missed half the message coming up here. But you said when you were in that community, you were the minority, and you felt very uncomfortable. And I've been in that situation most of my adult life, working in the city and even going to a predominantly, actually, African-American church in West Philadelphia. I was the only Caucasian in the church. And I felt a little uncomfortable being there. But what I really want to, the point I really want to make is I have a friend of mine, a very good friend of mine, he and his wife, and they're black. And we've been friends. In fact, the church where I met Frida is where we met these guys. And they're actually downstairs in new members class. I hope they really join this church. But he and I have had a lot of talks about racial issues and over the years, and I've been trying to understand his point of view, and he's been trying to understand my point of view. But you said something that sparked my mind, and this friend of mine is always trying to get me to understand this, and I just really couldn't put my mind around it until just what you just said, that you felt uncomfortable being the minority. And I thought to myself, well, this is what my friend has been trying to tell me all along, that this is what he feels, not every day, but this is what a lot of black people feel every day. Not all, but a lot feel that way every day, being the minority, being in a crowd. Like he used to go to a church in North Carolina, all-white church. They loved it. They loved the pastor down there. The people down there loved them. I mean, we would go down there when we visited them. We would go to that church, and if Kenny wasn't there, or if his wife wasn't there, they were like, hey, where they at? And when they found out that they were leaving and moving back up to Pennsylvania, I mean, their people were heartbroken. So he had a really good relationship, but I'd never put that together. It was like, wow, this is what you feel every day, what I felt for a few minutes. And I don't know, I just wanted to share that.
Anyone else have a narrative? One of the things that I was thinking was that a lot of times the armed services are kind of a great leveling, a great place where you're going to meet all kinds of people who aren't like yourself. I wonder if there might be anyone who's had that experience in the... No. Okay. Oh, there we go. Ross.
Yeah, basic training was an eye-opener for me. There were people there who were going in the Army or go to jail. There were people who had volunteered. The draft was not in force at that point, but it was quite a melting pot of everyone coming together, and the military trying to change you from being an individual to being a part of a unit, which was transformative at 18 for me, but you're becoming part of something larger, and it was very positive, but it was eye-opening for me. I grew up in Virginia, and so I didn't think about racial things when I was growing up, but I did in that environment, and I learned a lot.
I kind of forget how many years ago this was, probably 30 or more, but I got a phone call one day from a woman who was looking for a Baptist church, and she found our church's name was Berith at the time, and she asked me for a ride because she wanted to go to church, and we decided to give her a ride, and it developed a relationship. She was a single mom with 3 young boys. 2 of them had black fathers. She was on welfare. And we were friends for many, many years until, I don't know, probably 10 years ago. She had some health problems and she went home to be with the Lord. But her whole life was a struggle, just making ends meet and also probably one of the greatest days of her life is when she, through the government, they provided training and she was able to get a nursing assistant job. And she just thought, she was just so excited to have that and be able to provide for her boys.
Run Mike around up there.
Well, this is good.
And said you needed some exercise.
Yeah.
I've never talked in a microphone before, so this is scary. But as a child, I went to church in Camden, New Jersey, and then we moved out in the suburbs and didn't live there, but went to church there. And it wasn't a racial neighborhood when we were there, but my friend whose dad was the pastor in that church came back, and we said, let's go back to the Wesleyan Methodist Church and just see what the neighborhood's like. And somebody said, don't go there or you'll be shot. It's so dangerous, the police will tell you to leave. And we thought, let's try it. So we went, and I think we have to remember that most of the people in these neighborhoods are just like us. They walk their children to school. People came out and we probably spent 2 hours there talking to the people in the neighborhood. They were wonderful people, and we don't need to totally be afraid. Granted, it's dangerous in some situations, but most of these people are just like us.
I don't know how many of you have listened to Howard Eskin through the years. Maybe none of you have, I don't know, but some of the guys probably have. Howard Eskin was a sports commentator, had a show on WIP for many years, and he did the afternoon drive time, so I would hear him sometimes coming home. And there was a lot of things that I didn't agree with what Howard Eskin said, but one of the things I thought was pretty good was that he said that people are people, and that if we could just figure out a way to understand that maybe life might go a little better. We try not to denigrate other folks, but realize they were facing all the same issues and problems that we were. The second point he made about it being about changing the narrative, that's problematic for me in some ways. It's like, okay, we're going to rewrite history. But I think the way he was approaching how we've handled the issue of drugs and of drug addiction in America, I don't know how to feel about that. There's just been so much violence and death related to drugs coming into this country and being controlled by organized criminal activity that you just wonder how we could have had any other response. But I heard him saying that maybe the response that we need to have is to be a little more not accepting of the problem, but rather try to have a little engagement and sympathy for the people, for the children that are involved in this activity. Clearly, a lot of this activity is run by people who are under 18, and that's just a scary thing for us. We go on, would I go to Kensington and walk down the street? I went one time. I took the subway to meet there was a guy who was pastoring a church in Kensington, and I said, okay, I'll just get on the Market Street line, and I'll just keep going, and I'll get off, 3 or 4 stops up in Kensington and find this guy's church. Because I'm a big public transit guy. I love to use public transit when I'm in a big city. I hate to drive. So I get there, and it's a little bit scary, to the point where when I'm getting back on the subway to get out of there, I couldn't use my token wasn't working. The only way to get on the subway there and in Kensington is if you make friends with this guy who's dealing with the gate, and and he lets you in. There are no SEPTA employees at this station. You just have to realize that this guy is the guy who is the gatekeeper of the Kensington Market Street L stop. So, I was just in Chicago for a wedding that had been delayed for 2 years, and I found it. I was with my cousin and his husband, and her husband, and my brother and sister, and my brother's wife. And these are people who live in the suburbs. Well, actually, my cousin and her husband live right in the center of Madison, Wisconsin. So they can pretty much walk everywhere. And the center of Madison, Wisconsin, actually a very nice area. The state government and the campus of the University of Wisconsin are all right there. So I said, okay, we want to go and see the art museum. Okay, so we can go. We could do a couple things. Jim could get his car out of the garage, and we could drive up there and park for $50 or whatever it would cost in Center City. Or we could take the transit. This was a unique. My cousin said she had not been on a bus for 50 years. I couldn't believe it, but I wonder, maybe that's a more common experience than I think. But it gets you proximate when you use the public transit to folks that you don't see every day. Anyway, I don't really have any more questions. The 2 points he was making is that we need to be proximate, we need to change the narrative. And what we have to do is figure out what the narrative is that's true. Here we got Scott is going to say something.
Hey, Tom. That was just a great little video there. And I'll come back to that in a second. But you asked, had we been in situations where we were the minority? And Trudy and I were church shopping before we found Springton Lake. And we spent several Sundays in Chester City at, oh, okay. And what was the name of the place? Tom Tarosian was the leader there, and it was interesting and valuable experience. When I travel, I used to travel in my job, and we're going to start traveling again, but during the past 2 years we haven't been. But when I travel on Sunday mornings, I like to go to a local church. And in Atlanta, I attended a black church, and that was so welcoming and vibrant. It was amazing. Now let me come back to this Just Mercy. So Brian Stevenson is the author of the book Just Mercy, and it was made into a movie. I don't know if that was mentioned here. But I can recommend it. When the George Floyd thing happened, I turned to my boys, Ben, Perry, Sawyer, and Sky. They're kind of like a youthful, new vision kind of people, these young men in my life who helped me to have a different perspective. And they all went to Temple and have, I think, a good perspective on these things. So I asked them, what books can I read? What resources can you suggest? And they suggested, Sky particularly recommended Just Mercy. And it tells the whole story of Brian's and his experience with this man who was unjustly imprisoned on death row, and the story of how he was liberated. And it's in it you learn how biased the situation can be. And it kind of like kicks the door open a little bit. We hear these things like that there is systematic racism. Is that the word? Is that the right? And And when you hear that phrase and you think, well, I don't see it. But then, when you see a story like this and it becomes real, and this is a true story. So I would just recommend to anyone, it's a great movie, to watch the movie Just Mercy. Really, really good.
Thanks. I don't know if this is exactly relevant, but after the George Floyd thing, two of our millennial age children were living at home due to COVID, and it struck us all incredibly hard. And our daughter particularly was just wanted to know more, wanted to think about this, wanted to understand this, wanted to learn more about the Black experience in America because we felt so ignorant of it. And so she went online and she found all these resources and books and movies, like many of them non-Christian, but like just historical, like what you could read and learn about to better understand the Black experience, which I've been largely ignorant of. So we watched movies like Selma, and there were a couple others, and to me that's a very important first step, is just to learn about these things and about what went on in that city in Oklahoma and the civil rights movement and things like that. And it made me realize how much I don't know about that. And that's just, for a Christian or a non-Christian, that's a place to start. And then I started reading some books. I read one by a young Christian Black woman called Be the Bridge, where she explains her experience in a white megachurch in the South, and then just has started this movement of like discussion groups, mixed race discussion groups, to just read the book and talk through it and be proximate, talk to black people who doesn't normally happen in my experience. And then another book about a woman who came over from Nigeria, not a Christian, but just what was her experience being an immigrant to our country, and something I was totally unfamiliar with. And now I'm reading another book about a young man who grew up on the streets of Philadelphia and what it was like for him going to school, having to worry if he was going to get jumped by other classmates and things like that. And, a lot of it's uncomfortable, but it's eye-opening. It's all different perspectives, and it's just helping me better understand other people's experience.
On the far right here.
I have two things. I'm not sure they're totally on topic, but the whole proximate idea, I grew up outside of New York City, and my father commuted into New York City, and it's funny, we have totally the different, I think, approach. My family thought anybody not like them, they wanted to know better. I mean, my parents' best friends when I was growing up were Pakistani, were immigrants from Pakistan, and we had curry with them most Saturday nights and so on. So I'm blessed in that I've had a more diverse experience, so I certainly agree with the proximity part. I agree with the, seeking mercy, et cetera. I think, like you mentioned, you think about the drugs and what they've caused, and that's hard. I mean, he has a very particular perspective in the video. Of course, that's what he does for his living, and I think that it's not simplistic, though. I mean, first and foremost, he compares alcoholism and drug addiction. Alcohol's legal in this country and drugs are not. So, I mean, that just jumped out to me that, that's a whole bigger debate, right? I mean, they're and what the age of majority is and so on. I mean, those are not simplistic things in our society, and I think people of faith, probably very faithful people, have very differing views on all of that. But, how do you, I mean, we're told to obey all laws biblically. So when you look at drugs being illegal and alcohol being legal, there's an innate difference. Not that the consequences of it aren't all horrific to everybody. It's just something I was thinking.
I know that perhaps our time is over, but I just wanted to say that with Pamoza, it's actually interesting because we take a lot of people. So the other time, Janet Daly went with us to an African American church, and to my knowledge, she was the only white person there. And it was just interesting to see the interaction. That's all I was going to say.
I think we'll leave it there. And there was one thing I did want to mention that's going to happen in the second half here. It's the second part of Brian Stevenson's talk, and that he makes a great emphasis in his last point that there's hope. He's not a guy who's just going to lay out this terrible problem, aren't things awful? He believes that there's hope. And I think it'll be instructive for us to hear the end of his story and hear that message of hope that he has, as well as this discussion of what the problems are. Okay, thanks very much, and we'll see you next week.